Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. We're going to present our economic and budget outlook. Sorry, that was 2 weeks ago. We're going to present our Q3 expenditure monitor forecast. Michelle Gordon is with me as one of the analysts on the report, and Matt Stevenson's in the room as well. Michelle's going to walk you through a technical presentation. I'm going to make a short statement, and then we'll go to questions. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. So the purpose of this report is to provide information on spending by the province through the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year. In this report, we identify changes to the province's spending plan, compare actual unaudited spending against both expected spending and last year's spending, and we track the status of unallocated funds. The information in this report is based on our analysis of transactions recorded in the province's financial accounting system as of December 31st, 2022. We also note that all figures in this report are unaudited. Final audited figures will only become available with the release of the public accounts at the end of this fiscal year. So first, let's look at the province's spending plan. The province started the year with a spending plan of $193 billion. There were no changes to the spending plan in the first quarter. In the second quarter, the overall spending plan remained the same, but the province made internal budget reallocations. During the third quarter, the spending plan increased in all sectors except post-secondary education. Notably, the other program sector spending plan increased by $1.1 billion, the health spending plan increased by $183 million, and the children's and social services sector spending plan increased by $146 million. These spending plan increases were partially offset by a $1.3 billion transfer from the contingency fund. At the end of the third quarter, the province's overall spending plan increased to $193.2 billion. So here we look at spending plan changes in more detail. Within the other program sector, there was a $276 million increase for the Motor Vehicle Accident Claims Fund, and this was due to an anticipated change in its accounting treatment. There was a $245 million increase for economic development and innovation, largely for auto sector subsidies. And there was a $235 million increase to support the City of Toronto's 2022 budget shortfall. In the health sector, there was a $183 million increase for the operation of long-term care homes. Finally, in the children's and social services sector, there was a $146 million increase for ODSP. So next we compare the province's actual unaudited spending against expected spending. So the province divides its spending plan by quarter, which we call expected spending, and this reflects historical spending patterns, seasonality, and other factors. In the first quarter, the province expected to spend $40.7 billion and ended up spending $39.9 billion. In the second quarter, the province expected to spend $43.3 billion and ended up spending $40.6 billion. In the third quarter, the province expected to spend $45.3 billion and actually spent $42.3 billion. In total, the province spent $6.4 billion, or 5% less than expected through the first 3 quarters of the 2022-23 fiscal year. So this table shows actual and expected spending by quarters. All sectors spent less than expected. So this was led by other programs at $3.5 billion less than expected, health at $1.3 billion, and education at $844 million. Here are some of the key programs with lower than expected spending. Ministry of Transportation spent $1.2 billion less than expected on Metrolinx and municipal infrastructure projects. Ministry of Energy spent $665 million less than expected on electricity subsidy programs. Ministry of Infrastructure spent $644 million less than expected across various infrastructure programs. Ministry of Health spent $605 million less than expected on public health. Ministry of Transportation spent $462 million less than expected on Metrolinx and municipal transit operations. And MCCSS spent $453 million less on social assistance programs. The Ministry of Education spent $432 million less than expected on elementary and secondary education programs, which mainly fund school boards. They also spent $396 million less than expected on childcare programs. So next we compare first, second, and third quarter spending in 2022-23 against last year's spending. So overall, spending over the first 3 quarters of 2022-23 was $2.9 billion, or 2.4% higher compared to last year. The sectors with the largest year-over-year spending increases were health at $1.1 billion, education at $0.9 billion, and children's and social services at $0.7 billion. As of the end of the third quarter, the other program sector spent $0.8 billion less than last year. So here are some of the key year-over-year changes. Childcare spending is up $762 million from the previous year, mainly because this is the first year the province is implementing its commitment to provide an average of $10 a day daycare by 2025. Interest on debt payments is up $762 million. Payments to physicians is up $518 million. Drug program spending is up $422 million. The operation of hospitals is up $353 million. And the operation of long-term care homes is up $342 million. So lastly, we track the status of the province's unallocated funds. The province started the fiscal year with a $4.6 billion balance in the contingency fund. There were no transfers from the fund in the first quarter. During the second quarter, the province transferred $373 million from the contingency fund to various programs. In the third quarter, the province transferred an additional $1.3 billion from the contingency fund to various programs. These transfers included funding for auto sector subsidies, funding to support the City of Toronto's 2022 budget shortfall, funding to extend the COVID-19 worker income protection benefit, funding for the ODSP program, and for the operation of long-term care homes. At the end of the third quarter, the contingency fund had a remaining balance of $2.9 billion. In the government's third quarter finances, it stated that the contingency fund had a remaining balance of $1.8 billion. So this suggests that there's been another $1.1 billion in drawdowns that were recorded after December 31st, and these will be reviewed in our Q4 report. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. At the end of the third quarter, the province's total spending plan was up $209 million, reaching $193.2 billion. Of the $193.2, the province expected to spend, so they expected to spend $129.2 billion by the end of December of 2022, but the actual unaudited spending was less than that. It was $122.8 billion, $6.4 billion less, or about 5% less than they expected to spend. All sectors spent less than expected, led by other programs, health and education. Spending 5% less than expected is unusual compared to the recent historical average of 2.7%. However, the lower than expected spending of $6.4 billion was not unexpected by us. It's consistent with our spending projections in our economic and budget outlook reports. And remind you that our budget, our EBO, our forecast is we'll see something pretty close to a balanced budget for this fiscal year. And while the government is spending less than expected, it's important to note that spending over the first 3 quarters of this year was $2.9 billion, or 2.4% higher than this time last year, with the largest spending increases in health, education, and interest on debt. Would there be any questions? Happy to go to questions.
You would express some concern about the size of the contingency fund before. How do you feel about where it is now?
So that's something we looked at in the economic and budget outlook, and we'll have another look at it later. It's not something we really get into in this particular report. So my comment on contingency funds is I think it's important for a government to have one, but it needs to be of a proper size to deal with, operational emergencies. That's how it's always been used in the past. And then we've seen that fund grow considerably in the last few years. The pandemic certainly induced part of that. And in our last economic and budget outlook, we projected a fairly large contingency fund over the next 5 years, which to me is my position on that is that it's important that the government articulate its spending plans in detail to MPPs, and putting, oversized contingency fund is not a transparent way of budgeting.
What about the underspend? You said that is not usual but not surprising to you. Why would underspending at the rate that you're seeing now be a problem?
So again, it's a transparency issue. Traditionally, we've seen underspend. So government will always have to underspend. By law, they're not allowed to overspend. So you're always going to err on the side of coming in a little low, and that's perfectly normal. We've seen underspends in the past of around 2 or 2.5%-ish, 2.2 to 2.7. And now we're seeing a trend, an increase in the underspend amount over the last couple of years, and so far we're seeing that trend continue into this year. And that's a problem, again, because a government, when they're presenting their spending plan, they are getting approval from the people's representatives, MPPs, on what that plan is, how they plan to use public funds. And if there is a significant amount of money that isn't being used but had been approved, that's, to me, is not that doesn't allow MPPs to have good insight as to what, the use of the money that they've approved. So they say, we're spending X on this program. How come you only spend X minus whatever? The one argument, as I mentioned, was you can't overspend, but there's a limit to how much lapse or how much fiscal space you create for yourself. So it comes again down to budget transparency.
Could that be a way to produce either a balanced budget or a surplus come budget time?
Well, by definition, if you underspend, then whatever is left over automatically goes to reducing your deficit or increasing your surplus, and effectively goes to pay down debt. So that is by default what happens to funds that have been requested but not spent. Whether that's a deliberate motive on behalf of the government, I obviously cannot say. I have no idea. But that is the end result of what happens with an underspend.
Are those auto sector subsidies, are they broken down at all, or is it just auto sector subsidies?
We don't have the breakdown in this report, and that's a really good question, because the purpose of the report is to highlight variances in the plan to the actuals. What's happening up to this point in the year? MPPs, you approved all this money last year. This is the only report that tells you what's actually gone on in terms of actual spend until you see the public accounts. And if we highlight areas that we think are significant variances, then really the MPP's staff's job is to get in there and find out why and ask those questions to the minister. We can help a little bit. We're not built to get into a lot more detail than that.
So I guess a similar question for that ODSP increase. I don't remember off the top of my head what the jump up was, but there was the 5% raise promise. Would that increase just be them following through on that, or did you budget in that 5% increase? Just kind of what's going on
I'm
here?
going to defer to Jeff on that.
That's correct. That's the change that reflects that 5%. Because if you recall the timing, it was announced over the summer, and so this is to reflect that change.
I know you said the overall child care spending was up, but spent less than planned. Is that, do you think, because the program has maybe taken a little longer to get off the ground?
Exactly, that's the reason. So it's a little bit under, it takes longer, and that's typical of any new program. Just about any new program, it's always, there's a little bit of startup time that's perfectly normal. So.
But definitely worth a check-in with the government on how that rollout is going, because it seems to be a little bit slower than planned.
There's another big underspend is infrastructure, and that's a perpetual thing, because it's always hard to predict how projects will go. And COVID certainly wrecked project schedules in a big way, and I think that there's still a bit of an impact on that. But again, we only report at the high level. We don't have details on the actual projects.
We don't have anything Metrolinx related either, so.
Well, this is one tiny data point.
Yes, I'll spare you the details on Metrolinx that I know of anyway.
No, don't.
No.
Actually, asking the question, do you have details on the Metrolinx?
No, we don't have any details of Metrolinx. The only I'm referring to when we were doing our climate work and the infrastructure work we were trying to do, and the data that was coming in was all there's a lot of operational data that we had to sort of sift out to be able to figure out what was going on. So
Operation or capital or both?
well, that was the issue, was we're trying to get capital So it was
Well-
just, bottom line, it's a complicated program. And because it's transportation and not typical infrastructure, there are a lot of other variables to it. So it just took us longer to kind of wade our way through some of the data that they gave us when we were putting together the climate piece. Just, it's a different business.
I understand all of that, but my main concern is the crosstown. It's not open, it's not running, it has no production date. Do you have any
We have
idea
no
of
idea.
the money that's flowing to continue the project, or the money that's coming? There's obviously monies having to go to complete the project.
Oh, yeah,
but-
sure.
But is it overspending? Is it
We don't know.
stop of spending?
We don't know. We haven't looked at that project. We are starting a project on infrastructure and kind of capital spend writ large. We're just getting our teeth on. We had an MPP request for that, so we've probably been at it for about a month now, just sort of getting our feet wet and trying to figure out the lay of the land. So we may end up with something on your question, but pretty far away from that right now.
But you're concerned enough to, sorry, so,
We don't get concerned when MPP asks us a question, and if we think it's within our mandate to answer, then we will go ahead and do it.
see where I'm coming from, I'm going, a lot of money's been spent.
Yeah.
There is actually no completion date or even words coming from the government or Metrolinx about why there's no completion date. There's monies that have or flowed. You see where I'm coming from, and I know where you're coming from. I'm just trying to fill in the gap.
Sure, and I think as we work our way through the study that we're undertaking, we might be able to. I don't know. So we'd be happy to be able to fill in the gap if we could. I just can't tell you right now that we will be able to or not be able to. So it's certainly something we're aware of.
Does the underspend on elementary and secondary education programs, does that take into account anything related to childcare, or is all the childcare stuff within childcare programs?
I'm going to defer to Jeff or Michelle on that one.
That's right. Those are two separate lines. Yeah.
So we're spending more on childcare this year than last year, largely because of the $10 a day promise, correct? But there's still an underspend based on projections on childcare this year. I still have that correct?
Right, so we're spending more than last year because a new program is introduced, but relative to what they had planned to spend on childcare, it's coming in a little under.
Okay.
So which suggests a slower than expected rollout of the start of the program.
Okay. There's some interesting RFPs out right now that probably have to do with that, so thank you for that. Anything else you guys want to highlight? I don't have any more questions.
I want to get back to the transparency question just real quick. So it's the reason I get a little hung up on this is because, again, it's the people's representatives approving the people's money to be spent. And if there are variances according to plan, I think it's important that and there can be very good reasons. I mean, I think a good example is electricity subsidy, right? We're seeing a very big underspend. And we've had a pretty darn warm winter so far, and that explains probably a good chunk of that, given that most of the subsidies are consumption-based. So these are the sorts of things that MPPs should be able to ask of the government, and the government should be able to explain as to why there are changes and variances to the spending plan. So that's when I get into my little rant about transparency, that's largely where it's driven.
And sorry, just further clarification on the childcare thing. Would like a childcare capital program still fall under the childcare section here?
This is an operating line, the childcare transfer payment.
Okay. Okay. So would a capital thing fall under the what was it, the
Yeah,
secondary?
there is a little bit of childcare capital in like the school capital lines.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a much smaller amount.
Yeah,
We can look it up
Yeah,
for you.
it's small, but it's like for childcare that's in school buildings.
Okay.
Yeah, they've got a program to build out childcare spaces in schools. So that is in the government's number. But when we mention childcare, it's purely the operational side of it.
Hey, can I just, the Metrolinx, my vocabulary
please
is
do.
different than your vocabulary. So describe what, as far as the crosstown, your investigation, how would you describe that?
How would I describe the crosstown?
The crosstown, the concerns with the MVP, and is it an investigation? What is it?
No. So the question was, the government has a very significant infrastructure plan. They're looking to do a lot of, to quote from their campaign building. What is, what is your assessment of the cost of this thing? Is it being costed? How come they're, have a look at the costing, have a look at the ability for them to roll this out, and we're gonna see huge cost overruns or not. So that's how the way the question comes in. And then, of course, we have a look at it and we say, okay, well, what of this can we actually answer? So we're gonna look at the capital plan. We're gonna look, okay, so here's what they wanna do. Here's how much they've allocated. Have they allocated enough? That'll probably be one of the big questions that we look at. Whether we look at specific projects, it's unlikely because we're looking at tens of billions of dollars of capital. I don't know that we're going to focus specifically on Crosstown. I doubt that we would do that. But again, if the numbers are sufficient, then maybe we will. If it's a big chunk of that overall spend, we probably will. But it's not going to be an audit of we don't do audits, right? We're going to look at, looking forward, what are the costs, what are going to be the budgetary impacts of this capital plan, and is there enough money set aside, and are there other things are there risks to the achievement of that capital plan? And I think maybe we'll tie it to something we're going to present next week, which is our analysis of healthcare spending, the healthcare spending plan. So, for example, the government has said they're going to add 1,800 new hospital beds. Well, those hospital beds, not only do you have to build them with bricks and mortar, so to speak, but you also have to staff them. And that costs money. So you need to have equipment, you need to have nursing, you need to have et cetera, et cetera. So what we've done is we've done a workup in terms of how much, staff is going to be required to staff those 1,800 new beds and how much that will cost. What has been what is the rate of, is the government going to be able to staff it? We're doing an analysis to say, okay, here's what we've seen in the past, here's what is coming, here's what we know is how long it takes to get people up to speed. Is there not, are we going to have a problem here or not? Is there going to be a risk? So we would do a similar sort of look at with the infrastructure, with the capital project.
When is that healthcare spending report coming in?
Next week. Same time, same place as next week.
All right.
Okay? So far.
Planned.
Planned. Yeah, it's a big one, though. It's a big one. So.
Do you have any other MPP request ones that are coming down the pipe?
We've had a request on education spending. We've had a request on a particular, I think Ontario Place, which has been made public. So we to look at the cost estimates around that. So these are all early stage for us right now.
And next week's report is in response to 2 MPP requests.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Have a great day. Thanks for coming in. Enjoy the winter weather.